Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Bitcoin with me and with Daniel. Say hello, Daniel.
Hello, thank you.
And today we're going to be talking about the advantages that there are to be gained from thinking about Bitcoin as if it were a poker game. And this is specifically with reference to an idea that Daniel articulated very recently in an interview he was doing with Briar Dispatch. And there is a link below to that interview. And I wanted to speak with Daniel and allow him, space and time to really unpack what he's saying there, because I think it's very important, and I think it impacts a great deal on both how one should think about being an investor in the Bitcoin space, as well as how one should actually think about being an actual gambler in the Bitcoin space. So take it away, Daniel.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks. Well, I think that the kind of the biggest thing is that the issue is ethics. Okay, it is morality. And people come into Bitcoin with a morality that is inappropriate and that kind of makes them victims. And
I would say, I mean, how when we talk off air, a lot of our discussion is always turning on how useful it is to be precise about language. And I definitely think that morality here indicates a set of standards that are assumed to be widely held and have a great deal to do with the idea that lying is bad.
Sure. Well, so if you are playing a game with friends, and I think poker is a particularly good metaphor, but if you just think of risk or anything like that, obviously the way you interact with your friends in the game is not like how you interact with them outside, and it is fine to betray them or to mislead them. And at the end, somebody is going to win and somebody else is going to lose, but you are still you're still friends at the end. Okay, and people come into Bitcoin, and it is like they do not realize that they are playing a game, and they are putting themselves at risk to lose all of their pieces in the game very easily. And if the metaphor of the poker game is something that's going to just in general protect you a lot, and you should imagine that you are playing a poker game and other people are playing a poker game, and you should assess who is a better player, and think about like what is your strategy right now.
Yes, and I think building on some of the stuff we've talked about before in our investment chats, right? We've talked about how knowing yourself is the first and most important part of being a strong investor or a strong thinker. So while if you're sitting at a table and you're assessing the strengths of the other poker players, you have to have a whole category for assessing what you think your strengths are and trying to cultivate some sense of what these other players think your strengths are in order for you to be an even stronger player, right? I mean, I think that the best poker players or the best game players, whatever game it is, are the ones that likewise maintain a self-awareness, a skepticism towards themselves with regards to the fact that there may be ways in which they are being understood as players that they may not yet be aware of. And that once you kind of take that level of control, you become a stronger player in the market. So this can translate into, things like if we're talking about in the realm of behavior choices that people make when they are trading, because when one's investing, it's a much more kind of passive position. But to know yourself well enough to know that you might anticipate what your weaknesses are and put in place compensatory procedures, right? Whether those are stop loss orders, or let's say, you know, for example, that you have certain weaknesses with regards to security protocols. Okay, you can do things that can make your life much more simple. So certainly, thinking about the fact that you are actually at a game, and that everybody is your friend in as much as they are interested in doing the minimum required to be able to keep playing the game. That the underlying basic common goal that any group of people sitting at a poker game have is to continue the poker game. So you're not going to blow up the table. You're not going to, you know, actually shoot the people at the table. But your willingness to engage within the construct of the game and effectively trying to kill them is very real.
Well, yeah, there's that, and also if there's a player who is incompetent,
Mm-hmm.
you can't really protect that player. And
Nope.
let me go back to your point about skepticism, because I think thinking strategically is very important, and that, you know, and that's what you do in a game. Well, yeah, which is what you said, and strategy is inherently an exercise in self-examination, because you have your preferred strategy based on your understanding of the game, but you have to expect that there are other people with different understandings that you don't understand. You know,
Right. I totally agree. So I'm thinking about what you said about, you know, so if you have a player at this table who's incompetent, which is one extreme, or let's just say you've got players at the table where you can see that there's real asymmetric information, knowledge.
yeah,
Okay, so you cannot start from a premise that says, you know, a game, a poker game or a game of Risk or whatever, it doesn't have inbuilt assurances that you're going to be protected from making wrong or stupid choices, right? I mean, otherwise no one would win the game. It's not a game. So the question then becomes, if you're the player with greater competency, if you're the player with greater knowledge, what is the moralistic position? What is the correct position? What is the best position that you should take with regards to exploiting that to your own advantage? Because there is this kind of bizarre neutral place that seems to be imported to some of the discussions around this, where even if a commentator or a voice person in the space will say, oh no, well, of course you don't want to protect people from themselves. You know, that's a kind of anti-freedom, anti-hacker, but you are open to condemnation if you go ahead and exploit it. And who gets to call whether or not that's a morally correct thing or not?
yeah. Well, so I would like to talk about the definition of the word scam for a moment here, because to me, you cannot expect that there will be universal agreement on whether anything is a scam, because somebody who, you know, there are small numbers of players who are very good, and they you know, they know what to do with something that might be very harmful to most people. Like, most people should never buy an option at all, right? But somebody who knows what he's doing would be irritated if he couldn't buy an option, you know?
Right. I think the same thing's true of buying on margin, right?
Yeah. And so like, I think that it was kind of a strategic error on my part earlier, a few years ago, when I said that altcoins are scams, because to me, it is true that altcoins are scams, and there are very, very good reasons not to think that they're much worse than they may at first appear. But it is obvious that most other people do not don't understand why I think they're scams, and a lot of the people calling them scams don't seem to get why I think they're scams either. So it's almost like, why don't we just stop calling them scams for now until people agree on what the problem is.
Yeah, and or what the language signifies, right? I mean, as you know, I'm working on a article to do with bubbles, and I hope to post video really soon. And it's the same kind of problem when a word becomes a vehicle for so many different types of meaning, many of which have kind of emotional, judgmental, moralistic overtones, and people start to use them in a jargon-esque way where you assume that the person who's hearing it knows exactly how you meant it. So it empties it of meaning. And I think that the kinds of critique that you bring to altcoins is different from the kind of critique that can be brought to Ponzi schemes, right? I mean, they are both things that anybody will just sort of lazily and fuzzily use the word scam. But actually, when you get down into the more specific critique, they're totally different types of criticism.
Oh,
Right?
so well, let me quick go over why I think altcoins are scams since I brought that up. But don't say anything about it. We can do another video on it some other time if you want. But basically, I think that people who would sell Bitcoin to buy an altcoin are engaging in a less strategic decision, and they don't realize that they are safest when they are sticking in kind of the biggest group of investors, at least, and that is kind of the way money works as far as my understanding of it goes. So money is the network effect, and money is basically a way for a group of people to invest in one another. So if you are leaving a big group for a smaller group, you are probably getting less. And the differentiators for altcoins are mostly stuff that I don't think actually matters. Like Ethereum is like, we have smart contracts, and Litecoin, they're like, we have a different mining algorithm. To me, that doesn't. It's not clear to me that really changes like the investment proposition there as far as what I'm really investing in. So to me, it's a poor strategic decision to buy an altcoin, and I think that that is something that lots of people will never understand.
Well, I mean, so I'm going to just kind of put some stuff out again, which is a little bit like a heads up to stuff that's coming more. But I very much agree with you in the context that if one is going to take a perspective on investing, which is a different creature than trading, then I think that to invest in things that stand a significantly high chance of being able to return your investment with purchasing power parity is where you should invest. Okay.
Sure.
I think that when we,
No,
I think that,
right. So if you are taking a time, if you understand what I said, and you tell me that my time frame is just shorter than the time frame it takes for people to understand that, then sure, like why not?
Right. But I think right. And the thing about that is that investing is it's a different layer. Okay? It's a different layer of approach than the one that sits on top, which has to do with what do I think the potential increase in value above purchasing power parity that I stand to gain. And I think one of the things, as you know, one of my pet peeves is the idea that we confuse long-term with investing and we don't understand that trading is something that can be done long-term also.
Okay. Well,
okay.
let me just quick respond to that, and then let's go back to poker. I told you not to say anything about
Yeah,
altcoins, but
I did.
let me take
I
it away
just
with
kept
it this
talking,
time.
which is terrible. I've got to stop.
But basically, so like I think that most of the people buying altcoins don't 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 get why they should buy them at all. Like you said, like to me, like if you are trading altcoins, you're basically predicting stupidity. And what my concern would be is I think lots of people don't realize that that is what they need to be doing, you know?
Right. I
And to
mean,
me,
you got to know
you
that
are somebody who might be good at predicting stupidity, because
well,
you
it
know that
depends on
that's
whether or not you have to be willing to know that that's what you're looking at. Again, back to the poker table, right? You have to be willing to acknowledge that there is stupidity playing out at the table around you. So the thing is that if you don't confuse yourself by calling it investing, and you don't even necessarily confuse yourself by calling it trading, but you actually call it gambling, in the layers of your mind where you sit down to think about what kinds of decisions are you making and what kind of persona and framework are you bringing to it, right? And recognizing that you are at a very complex game where people are making all kinds of decisions that are still unscrutable, right? I mean, no matter how advanced a player you are, you are never going to have perfect knowledge. Knowing that your position, let's say, for example, is to gamble on altcoins that do not have, and I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, right? But I agree that it is hard. I'm hard pressed to say that there are clear examples of other altcoins that yet have achieved the kind of group, mass, substance, and whatever metric you want to take on it to make it any kind of viable, comparable to Bitcoin. Like, if you want to take an approach there which goes, there's a great deal of volatility, there's a great deal of life, there's a great deal of movement, and if my main goal here is to make more Bitcoin, then that's the game that I'm sitting and playing.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So we are talking about a very multifaceted game with lots of niches that different people can serve.
I would argue that for those listeners, right, who are really into the altcoin space, who are really into whatever minimal amount of Bitcoin and so on and so forth, I think that what we're going to talk about more, and certainly what I'm going to let you unpack more, right, by being quiet, is that the poker metaphor is as applicable, if not more so, when and if you are going into the altcoin space with any kind of mission to make more Bitcoin.
Oh, yes, that now I like that. That's good. That's interesting. So, I don't really have I guess I agree. I don't really have anything else to say about that. So I'd like to talk about blaming the victim a little bit, because I am taking a blame the victim stance here. So I want to argue why that's a good idea. And the reason is that there is just so much opportunity for scams, and Bitcoin is growing so quickly that, and there's a constant influx of new people coming in, that it is it is kind of an absurd idea to expect to stem the tide. And you really need to focus most on protecting yourself first, and then whatever you can do to teach other people how to behave better that's really all you can do. And so I say that I take a blame the victim mentality, just because the idea that there is enough help available for all possible victims, there just isn't.
I think that's a really, I mean, it's a provocative way of phrasing something, but I think that's a really good point, because it points to some of the things that are really of great interest to me about the fact that the markets are so still free and so unregulated as to be so transparent with regards to the things about which one should be careful. And so, unlike the early 20th century and Charles Ponzi, or the late 20th century and Bernie Madoff, right? There was really no excuse for anybody out there to have missed the fact that BitConnect was a Ponzi scheme, or certainly loudly and widely and vociferously enough indicated so as to kind of go, and I suppose the other part has to do with, again, in the domain of things that are obvious, for which you really do not need fancy education or a great deal of experience or any of it to recognize and realize that if you're going to engage with it in any way, it may be a really big problem for you, or the existence of pumping and dumping, let alone stuff that's more sophisticated and we're able to see in terms of market manipulation in the big exchanges. I mean, interestingly, one of the things that is affecting the market to whatever extent, but we don't have the kind of transparency that we have elsewhere, are the futures, because there is still, there we're kind of bumping up against the degree of opaque shielding that traditional markets have developed, so as to need regulation to protect people, because regular people can't even sit and observe it well enough to know for themselves. I mean, if you're at a poker game and you can see everybody playing at the table, you have less excuse than if you're playing the poker table, playing with a screen in front of you and you don't know what they look like or how they're moving or anything.
Right. Yeah. Well, so you should go into Bitcoin and kind of expect to be conned. Like you should expect it to be a learning experience for you.
Exactly.
And, one of the things that no matter where you are, it's always easier to lose money than to make money. So if you hear ridiculous success stories in Bitcoin where some random person bought Ethereum and is now a multimillionaire or whatever, you have to understand that there's easy ways to lose tons of money too, because if you start trying to trade and you don't know what you're doing, you'll lose pretty rapidly, and there's tons of people.
Sorry to interrupt you, right? But this is exactly where I would like to make some contribution towards differentiating between gambling and trading. Okay? This phrase that gets repeated all the time with regards to don't fill in the blank more than you can afford to lose. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in casinos. And that was partly because I was working as dive instructor in the Seychelles, and the hotel and the dive shop and the casino and the accommodation all in the same place. So I had opportunity over a period of months to really observe kind of casino up front and close. And I think there's no question, right, that the only and best way to approach a casino is to walk in with whatever pre-designated amount of money, absolutely prepared to walk out with zero, and to protect yourself by making it impossible to just go get more. And then you can entertain precisely whether it's the Ethereum or it's the high stakes poker table or it's the slot machine where, this $100, it could make me $1,500. But I could also walk out with zero, and I'm going to go try and make that 1,000% with full consciousness and a plan that I may make zero. And so I think that when we start having the kind of moralistic kind of talking about greed, or about, in a more kind of legitimately compassionate kind of point of view, like people have been starved of yield, wages suck, anybody who's on a real mission to make a lot of money is in some ways reflecting the reality that we've all got kind of 10 years compounded lack of increase of whatever level of earnings we might have had before, or any of that stuff, right? But in that case, that's not trading. I mean, that's at a certain point, being able to make a predicted estimated value return to yourself, right, on any kind of realistic basis, moves into it's a total crapshoot, because in order to get a 10,000% return, generally speaking, you have to have the market moved by things that do not relate to sustainability over the long term, which is how you make investments. So that's my kind of take on it. What I do for myself and what I think is prudent is a different thing than saying there is definitely a drive out there, and how should we talk and think about it? And if we talk and think about wanting to go and get the insane returns, then talk to yourself in terms of what you're really doing and do it well.
Well, let me talk about like trading and like I don't know exactly what to call it, but like inherently, if you were trading, I would say that you're taking advantage of crazy people who are putting their money on things in crazy ways. You're taking advantage of other people's crazy emotions, and that's kind of like one way of looking at it. But another is like somebody has to moderate the insanity, and if you can successfully do that, you are taking advantage of crazy, greedy people. But you need somebody needs to be there doing that.
Yeah, I guess for me, that's where I see the difference between like the gambling framework, right? Where we are talking about, I mean, I'm resisting using the language about nothing to do with fundamentals, because I'm not interested in just importing old style language from old markets, right? But if what we're talking about is pure price speculation, that does not have something to do with expected real value in the future, okay, which is what I think the idea of saying, well, I'm going to go into this thing, and I think that its value, its legitimate value, not the emotional speculation plus manipulation of its price, regardless of whatever the thing is. But if I actually think this thing is going to grow and have greater value, then my trading framework has to do with, I think that it will be worth 2% more in a year, or 20% more in a year, or 50% more in 10 years, right? Or
Right.
even down to the legitimate kind of, I understand that there's a thing that's coming out and it's going to announce an actually legitimate thing that it's doing. And I think that will make a 5% return on its value. So that's a very different framework, right?
Sure.
Because
Well, wait, let me just say, yeah, I didn't quite get at the distinction you were trying to make earlier between trading versus gambling, because then I started talking about trading like the thing you weren't talking about. You were talking about trading as gambling, and I was talking about trading as reading people's emotions still.
right.
And so that I was still thinking about like blame the victim versus
Mhm.
you know just let's hope they learn. You know.
Yeah, exactly. But also, like, I mean, screw them. I'm here asserting that I'm not them and I'm
Right.
with.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If they learn
Um,
or not is irrelevant, right? Because to come back to the whole premise of like, if you think about this, whether it's in an altcoin space or it's in a Bitcoin space or it's just generally in marketplaces, like you have to think about the fact that you are in a complex game. And that ultimately the goal here is for you to win
yeah.
and to not destroy the game.
Right. Oh yeah, let's talk about destroying the game too, because if I so this goes back to the interview that
Right.
the discussion we had or I had on Briar Patch, and I would say that one thing that destroys the game is people who insist that the rules of the game are different from what they actually are, and to me that is kind of like who I was talking to in this discussion, and I was talking to some people who were very they were very very moralistic about BitConnect, and they were saying, "Ugh, what a terrible thing those people did," and I was just like, whatever. That's just Bitcoin, and they were trying to get me to oh yeah, and there was a journalist who was kind of like humiliating himself about his own sorrow for having written an article about a company that he thought was legitimate but turned out to be a scam, and it sounds like he investigated it very well, and then he posted a follow-up once he learned the truth. So it doesn't sound to me like he had anything to be sorry about, and they were trying to emotionally manipulate me to feel sad about my own conspicuously poorly researched videos. At least that is their criticism of them, uh, and it got weird. It got weird in there because there was some. They were in a place where they believed that they had to make me go along with them, or else the Bitcoin community would be ruined, and they're kind of like driving themselves crazy trying to maintain that they can protect people from scams, and it was kind of
Along
a
with,
disturbing experience for me. And
right.
they would be saner if they started using the poker game mentality a little bit more.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I think that part of the kind of cognitive dissonance, right, of having formed an idealistic perspective on how and why Bitcoin came into existence, what perennial, millennial, like dragons it's going to slay, and how it in and of itself is just a bringer of moral redemption and stuff. I mean, the trouble with this is that it clashes with the other kind of fundamental insights about the nature of power and money and autonomy and the reality that this is not in any way and in any shape an arena or set of arenas in which things are not going to involve real struggle and a very kind of raw and blatant display ultimately of how power actually works itself out in communities and how changes in balances of power, monetary, social, or otherwise, kind of get worked out, right? So there is this somewhat kind of naive, kind of outraged distress at the fact that Bitcoin, which is, crypto, which is one of again, the most transparent, stripped down, and explicit versions of all of the stuff to do with money and value and emotions and price, and that it isn't going to be a total, whatever your metaphor you like, Wild West or jungle or total display of all of the types of emotional and mental behavior that human beings have, which includes a lot of questionable stuff. And so, to a certain extent, getting into a space where you think that you're going to somehow come up with rules that are going to make all of that go away, and then simultaneously berate yourself for not being smart enough to have recognized that it's out there in the first place, partly because you can't emotionally deal with the idea that it's a poker game, man, and you may not be the best poker player at the table.
Yeah, and it's really only after you are you feel really pretty protected yourself that you can really offer help to other people at all for real. Like you know, like there's all of the this Bitcoin news stuff, but the incentives for manipulating it are very strong. So they were talking about the need to have a reliable Bitcoin news industry, and to me that's kind of like, I don't know
Right.
about that, you know.
Yeah, I don't know about that, and also I don't know about the news being that relevant to investing in Bitcoin. I think that the type of trading that I feel should be called gambling, okay? It all runs on news-ish,
Yeah,
right? Runs
yeah,
on news-ish.
right.
It's not really news, it's news-ish.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, right. And so, and I think trading is way, I'm going to keep banging my drum, but I really think that trading can be elevated to a layer on top of investing if we really divorce it from the gambling stuff. I mean, I'm all for like good gambling, just don't bullshit yourself or anybody else that you're doing something different from that, right? So I do think that, I'm sorry, I kind of got off into my own little headspace there about gambling and trading and
why don't we talk a little about like the specifics of strategy and how
yeah.
that's kind of like poker. And I have to reference an article called Everyone's a Scammer
Mm-hmm.
that was written by Michael Goldstein, and it's one of the top articles on the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute page.
Yep.
So I would really recommend that one. And that's kind of like the thing that kind of led me to the poker game analogy eventually. And it's just like it got to the point where everything, like there's so many scams in Bitcoin that just everything is being called a scam, and everybody has, I mean, obviously everybody has their own hidden agenda, like duh. And so weird surprises are always happening in Bitcoin, and people are losing tons of money, and it's like an everyday kind of occurrence. So it's best to think of everybody as a con artist. But I kind of want to take that one step further and just say, like, if you're playing a poker game, like nobody's a con artist, right? It's really just, of course,
Right.
everybody is attempting to give some kind of impression that's, you know, that's different
Maybe
from the reality of their cards, you know.
right. Well, I was going to kind of be sort of think I'm cute and say, well, at a poker game, everybody is an artist because everybody acknowledges that poker is the con, right? I mean,
Exactly, yeah.
that's kind of thing. And I kind of had lost my track there, but what I wanted to say about what is useful with regards to, news or newsish or a reliable source or whatever, I think it goes to, in order to be protected from being scammed, you have to really know why you're going into Bitcoin in the first place. And then you can practice willful ignorance, where in fact, you don't need to know 99.9% of anything that's described as news-ish.
No,
Because,
I just, yeah,
right?
news is
Right?
dreadful.
Right. But even that framework of like, look, if you are secure in the reasons why you invested in Bitcoin in the first place, then you know that there are really only certain major kinds of forces that might move you to consider investing more or taking out or whatever it is. But the need to pay attention to the wah is much reduced. You know, you made a really potent point in that interview about being willfully ignorant about things that you've predetermined do you risk you no harm to be ignorant of. And that is the exercise of a certain kind of freedom and a decision about really only paying attention to the things that you really need to pay attention to. And I
Sure,
think that
you need, and this is something that that has always bugged me in Bitcoin, because to me it really seems like most of the things people talk about is just almost like irrelevant, and like the most important information is stuff that nobody wants to talk about very much.
Right, because it's not particularly fast moving or dopamine or gambling like or whatever. Which again, if you need that, go get that, but don't confuse that for this other thing. I wanted to say that with regards to the Nakamoto Institute and the scam article, I will make sure there's a link as well at the bottom of this, so anybody who hasn't read it can. And I think that the point about willful ignorance, right, can maybe be brought into a conversation about, you know, you can only get scammed and conned if you're paying attention and listening. You know, if you're
I like that. No, that's willful ignorance right there. Like that's that's a very good point. Yeah. So if you just say like this whole area here, all of that is going to be just nonsense, I'll just skip learning about it. Yeah, I mean, if you can't, I mean, and you know, if you understand, if you really understand the rules of the game, you can sometimes say things like that. But of course, you can never really be sure that you understand the rules of the game.
You don't. And that's where the skepticism and the dynamic element come in, right? Which is that I think you should inform yourself. I mean, in order for a choice of willful ignorance to be okay, you have to have informed yourself enough to be reasonably sure that at this time and in this moment and for some period of time, you can afford to ignore it. But you need to be willing to come back and revisit that from time to time, check in, be aware, be in a dynamic process with yourself, to continue to be aware of the fact that you're choosing to be ignorant, but at any moment you can go choose to be not ignorant. And that you can rely on, you know, maybe a greater kind of metaphors within yourself to determine when and how to check in with your kind of chosen ignorances. And that those things are going to shift over time because new information is always emerging and other information is always becoming obsolete. So I think as long as one maintains a kind of non-dogmatic, dynamic approach, yes, you can totally go, look, I'm going to protect myself because there is not a thing out there that has the word lending attached to it that is in any way legitimate of any description. And I will keep my tendril of an ear enough kind of out there in the ether that should at any time something legitimate ever evolve. But in the meantime, I'm so not paying attention.
Yeah. And so if you don't look like you're playing poker, you look like an easy mark. You look like a like prey. So you should kind of act like it's a poker game, because that makes you look like somebody who isn't a mark. And of course, willful ignorance is a part of poker, because you have to imagine that anything anybody says is a way of manipulating you. You know, so you kind of just have to strategically tune people out, and if you're able to do that, then a true con artist will probably might see you as someone less useful to them, you know.
Well, maybe somebody even to recruit to join their team. I mean, I think what you're saying brings us back to what your kind of, you know, initial sets of observations are, which are recognize that you're at a game, cultivate an awareness about the players around the table, and ultimately bring it back to yourself, because at the end of the day, the strength of you as a poker player is about processing that information in to make your decisions for yourself in ignorance of what all that, right? Because I mean, to kind of change the metaphor, you know, it's you and your decisions. It's one and one's decisions. One has to wake up in the middle of the night with, right?
Yeah, and so one thing that I'm kind of concerned with in Bitcoin is I don't think that the so-called leaders in Bitcoin understand the poker game analogy very well, and this is kind of something that is causing political problems in Bitcoin. And I think that if we could understand that poker players can also cooperate, like within the game, as well as simply being rivals within the game, or I should say, I don't know about how easily that would happen in poker, but that is definitely what can happen in Bitcoin.
Well, and I mean, I think back to that part about, you know, on the most basic level, you have to have the people who are competing with each other agree enough to continue to have the game carry on. So you cannot just pick up your chips and throw them in the face of the other players, right? Like, I mean, there are these there, and so the political problems are the things that seem to be running the risk of getting in the way of continuing to play the game effectively enough so that you all net benefit, because the bigger and better and badder ass the game, the better it is for each individual entity trying to compete to win it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but so I think that you should, I mean, you not just look at everybody as potentially a con artist. You should really look, you should see everybody as like potentially both predator and prey under different circumstances. And if you're playing a game, there isn't anything wrong with you know, doing something to another player that they might not like, as long as you are still friends after the game is over. And to me, there's a difference between just talking about game chips that are well, of course, when you play poker, you're supposed to use real money, you know, so you do have to, you should play the Bitcoin game with people who you think will still be friends if the game didn't exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that, but I would also say my head went in a direction where, you know, maybe we can make another video kind of more focusing on this kind of topic, right? Which has to do with what are the minimum rules of conduct that are required in order to allow all the participants to remain friendly, okay, or willing to come back to the game another day. All right.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a big topic. Yeah, let's continue thinking about this.
You know, but I think one of the upsides for me one of the upsides for, you know, humanity, which sounds grandiose, but I think one of the great opportunities here of having as big and as well developed, even in its infancy, transparent market where we can study in a way that we haven't been able to before, all the forms of market behaviors, it will allow us an opportunity to really rethink, strip down and figure out what are the really essential rules that we want to put in place. Because for the first time since who knows when, we have the opportunity to really study what is not so bad, kind of bad, really pretty terrible, but really you should be, you know, able to protect yourself. And this very small cluster of things that are like, wow, this fucks with the experience significantly enough that it runs the risk of ruining the game.
Yeah. That's a good question too.
Will even go on, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't have an answer for that now, but yeah, that is something that I would like to continue thinking about. So I have one last note, and I want to mention the video that I recently made called "Cult Member Conversations" on Twitter, in which I made fun of people that I talk to on Twitter who are very focused on their reputations within the group that I call the Bitcoin core cult, or the the Blockstream cult
Right.
or whatever. Uh, and there's some very silly tweets in there that I make fun of, where people say things like I think that your reputation is looking suspicious there, and it's sort of like duh, like if you're playing poker, of course everybody is suspicious, and the very idea of having a reputation is absurd, like you
Right.
can
Right.
and like, I mean, if you are a programmer, you can have a reputation for writing good programs, right? So we can expect that you will write a good program next, and that has nothing to do with like what your secret financial arrangements are. But as far as like your actions in the game, like what some program you make is going to do, uh well, everybody's suspicious. Like there isn't well, and of course, well, this conversation in the video was I just use programming as an example, but there are many actions that you can take in the Bitcoin game, and the idea of taking actions to protect your reputation is kind of inherently against the idea of kind of like strategically finding a good position, and and not letting other people know what you're doing.
Right. And as you're talking, one of the things that's really running through my mind has to do with dynamism, movement, as opposed to static position, right? Because the whole process of thinking strategically or having a reputation is in the present participle part, right? You continue to have a reputation that is built on the aggregate of the things that you're doing. And so to try and take a perspective that goes, well, my aim here is to establish reputation X. And then once I have established reputation X, I am then going to, all my other actions are going to be around protecting reputation X. Instead of allowing reputation X to evolve into maybe X squared or possibly plus Y or, divided by Q or, and this idea that like, I mean, one can say it in a somewhat harsh way, but like one is only ever the most recent thing that one produced, right? Because it's the most recent layer that sits on top of all of the other things that people have either produced or done or not done. And so, the whole idea of a reputation as being something that's like fixed in like aspic jelly.
Well, and also the idea of hampering somebody else's moves in the game, or by threatening them with their reputation. That's totally absurd.
Right. But I also think that there's an even more subtle thing in here, which has to do with threatening those people or those people's decision making that has been based on your reputation as understood by them, which they need to have remain stable. Because if you do something to change that reputation, it requires that the people who have a relationship to the idea of your reputation must also adapt. And that's, also contrary to the idea of kind of thinking once, being convinced, and then kind of huddling down in obviously it's a theme with me, but I do think that the most resilient and the most authentic, I voice always comes from a place which is continuing to check in with what it went to bed thinking was certain yesterday. And being open to the idea that might change.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, I don't have anything else in my notes. Okay. Do you have anything?
Only that it's just, as ever, awesome to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to talking more with you in the series about stuff to do with prediction markets and how we can play the poker game best. So
okay, well, I like talking to you too. We don't need to say that after every video, though.
Oh, I know. I can I close it out. But I want anybody out there to know that, like, I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I've been enjoying it. So this has been a blast.
Okay, me too.
Talk to you later.
Bye.